Yes.
You can see my
it's working.
It's working, right? Very good. Thank you very much. Now, the previous speaker, we just heard the importance of the cities, which indeed is something that seems to often is neglected from international lawyers' perspectives. What I would like to introduce here, that is businesses, a business perspective, and in respect of rule of law gaps in the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, we can say, is it really fair to talk about rule of law when we talk about the Belt and Road? Because the Belt and Road, what is so interesting about the Belt and Road is that it's not particularly institutionalized. So it's not like an organization like the World Trade Organization, where we can talk about are the rule of law gaps within the World Trade Organization. But it's an initiative. It develops as it progresses with improved infrastructure along the Belt and Road. And the law is something that will develop as well between all the states that are involved in it and all the businesses involved in it as well. So, but nevertheless, I think it is important to talk about the rule of law. And the reason why I think it's important to talk about the rule of law is that for businesses, the rule of law can be quite essential when they have to consider investing or not. So, and businesses, of course, they are an essential part of the Belt and Road because not only in respect of creating this improved infrastructure, but also the infrastructure, when it's improved, should facilitate trade. So there is actually something that comes after the infrastructure has been improved, that is trade facilitation. So, and therefore, for businesses, they are a big part of the Belt and Road, and the rule of law is important for them. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, of course, when I wrote my chapter, there was not at that time so much focus on COVID-19. It didn't exist when I started writing it. There's been also growing concern in respect of the Uyghur population and their detainment in China. The Hong Kong situation has sort of escalated also. And then, of course, there's been this now going on for a few years, the trade war between the US and China. One can only hope that with the new administration in the US that this might change. But of course, these factors are also having an impact on the Belt and Road. Now, when we come to the law and the businesses, I would just say I'm not here to defend businesses because there are very different types of businesses. You will find businesses that are high risk-taking and would not particularly be interested in any sort of regulation, either soft or hard law regulation. They would consider just that the market do its job. But the thing is, the market is not perfect. So therefore, in my view, it is important that we actually have some regulation to in order to actually facilitate the trade. Then, of course, criminals are also opposed to the rule of law because if there, for example, room for corrupt practices where criminals can thrive, there are some who will make a business out of that. I'm not talking about those kind of companies. They don't have my particular interest here. But the rule of law, what it can do for those businesses that are interested in more stable markets, is that the rule of law can protect property and contractual rights. It's providing transparency in the various set of rules that this product that will go from a producer, one part of the world to another. All these sets of rules that they have to go through from country to country, well, it can be quite important that there's some transparency, so there's not too much red tape, or at least knowing that there's a red tape barrier when the product is supposed to go from one place to another. It's also protecting against corrupt practices. And then finally, the rule of law, it's also protecting all the way through from the producer of a product to the end consumer, because the consumer will ultimately also be part of the Belt and Road, because the products from China should end with European consumers, or products from Europe should end in China with Chinese consumers. So there's also something, when we talk about the rule of law, this interrelationship between consumer and producers. In my view, when we talk about the rule of law, it is not only concerning that states must comply with it, but also businesses, because we have businesses of a size today that have so much more economic power than some states have. So therefore, it is all of us that really should comply with the rule of law. Now, when we look at and the involvement for businesses in the Belt and Road projects, now there can be various legal uncertainties, and that's where the rule of law can help those businesses. And uncertainties will increase the transaction cost, and that means that the products will become more expensive. So what is really necessary is that, and where the Belt and Road Initiative can help promoting the rule of law in the countries along the Belt and Road, that is, of course, protection of human rights, the worker protection. What are the requirements here? The IP protection, contract enforcement, and so on. So I think that's quite essential, that if we can reduce the uncertainties there are in that respect, we can also reduce the transaction cost, and that should, from a theoretical perspective, make the products cheaper. So, but the rule of law, what is it? And that is indeed a good question. I think, first of all, it's about keeping law supreme, and that means that politics, economics, and so on, that doesn't have high-ranking level as the law. We must comply with the law. All of us must comply with the law, and no one is above the law. It does not mean that there's not a political space to make law. Of course there is, but once we make that law, it must have a specific role that we all must follow. Now, there's been various discussions about the rule of law, and I'm not going into that too much. Is it a thin? Is it a rule of law? There are also the categories at something we call a formal rule of law. That's a rule of law that is value neutral, and that is that no one, the rule of law itself is not a principle that can engage into the law. The law is as it is, whether we like it or not. Then there's a substantive rule of law, that is that not all law can be accepted, and that is that the rule of law itself imposes requirements on the law. Now, we'll here for this part today take a quite narrow approach to it, a more formal one, although what I've claimed elsewhere is that even the formal one cannot be completely value neutral. But for businesses, it is important that to know that the law is not retrospective, and that is that where the expectations we have the law, we cannot at one point a law would be introduced with retrospective effect. And then, of course, that the law is relatively stable. And that is that the law should not change too much or too often. And just to give you a very good example, something I have been subject to myself is here in Denmark. And I should say, as what Giuseppe, he also knows, my wife, she's from Venezuela. And when she moved to Denmark, we had many problems with the immigration authorities, and they had problems as well because there was a government at that time that could push through. Within just a couple of years, they managed to change the immigration law 18 times. And that means that the authorities, they couldn't really follow it. So that was an example of a law that was not stable, but this is just from my personal experience. But then we must have third-party institutions that are independent and impartial to settle issues, not only between government and the businesses, but also between government and the individuals, and also between individuals. And those courts must have some power, of course. They should be able to say to a government, you violated the law here, you must comply with it. That is simply a constitutional dimension and important rule of law element. And also that, of course, governmental institutions, they must not pervert the application of law. And that is that there must be protection in the administration of law, protection of the individual, because we have this sort of vertical power relationship here between government and an individual, or government and a business. Now, as I said before, there are certain aspects of this formal approach to the rule of law that cannot escape a substantive element. And that is that there is a certain degree of protection of political and civil rights. For example, the moment we say that we need an independent third-party institution to settle an issue between the individual and the government, we have already said something about a particular political preference, a governance system that we prefer over another. So therefore, there is a substantive element in the formal rule of law. So even if I try to narrow it down, it is still there. And that's one thing I think is highly important when we talk about the Belt and Road, and in particular China. And China, of course, when we say that there's so many actors involved in the Belt and Road, we must, of course, keep in mind that China is the one initiating it, and China has, of course, a special responsibility in its Belt and Road policies, because it's very likely that those policies, they will affect all those projects that would be made along the Belt and Road. There are three aspects of the rule of law that I would like to take out. One is about transparency, and that is transparency in both the political process of electing people who should make decisions, and for governmental decisions as well, and the lawmaking procedures and the law itself. All these elements, they need to be transparent for the businesses so they can see through and have an idea of what to expect. There must be access to justice. The impartial and independent third-party institution must be in place. And then there must be equality, and that is that no one is above the law. And that is, we have a situation with a business involved in a Belt and Road project, that they can feel that they are on equal terms if there is, for example, a state making imposing some requirements that might not have a legal basis, that it is actually possible for those businesses to try these cases and have a feeling that when they are before the courts, that they are equal with the governments. When we look at the rule of law, it is often associated with the state. We can ask, is an international element we can add to the rule of law? It's a bit more difficult, because when we talk about international law, and also what we heard the previous speaker say before, that they could perhaps be sometimes a bit too statist. Why not also look at the cities? But what I just want to say here is that this traditional international law framework is based on the idea that states are sovereign and states are equal, but whatever the state is doing inside It's an internal issue and not something that other states should interfere into. Now, of course, the moment we talk about transactions across various countries, then of course there will be this transnational element that we need to look into. The challenges with the rule of law and international law, that is, one, the connection between international law and national law, how is that? And the other one, that's this fragmentation we can see in international law, the various sectors. What do we do when trade law, for example, when it overlaps with human rights or with environmental law? And that's all something that can create legal uncertainties for businesses. Now, do we have any answers to some of these overlaps, cross-sectorial issues? And that's also something that's highly debatable. Higher ranking norms of international law, like Jus Cogens, okay, we can say, yes, we have something we call Jus Cogens. What it is a bit more of a challenge and will not necessarily create that certainty for businesses that they would like. Human rights, we can see there's reference to human rights in the UN Charter and its preamble and its main principles, but they're very abstract. What do we mean by human rights? And that's where there can be very different approaches to it between the states. Climate change law. What is the status of the climate change law? I should say here that it's part actually of the Belt and Road Initiative. Some of the policies are quite green, so we can say in that respect we might get some certainty from the Belt and Road side about what do we mean by climate change law. I should also say that we might also find out in, well, hopefully not too long, the relationship between climate change law and human rights, at least in Europe. There's a case pending in the European Court of Human Rights concerning is climate protection of the climate. Is that something we as individuals can expect that states they must do, and if they don't, they violate human rights law? But international courts and tribunals, they can help to clarify these overlapping elements of the law. But not only courts and tribunals, it's also something that can come through those policies that are developed in the Belt and Road. Now, the Belt and Road, again, as I said initially, as I said in the beginning, it's not one particular institution. We just can say, okay, this is the Belt and Road institution. There are various institutions involved in it. But there are some overall principles that are quite important here, and that is that Belt and Road policies, they must be in line with the UN Charter and international law. But then we also see cooperation among the actors involved in the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road Initiative is inclusive. We should all be able to participate in it. It's dialogue-based, and of course, when we say something is dialogue-based, we should also say, okay, this is not just about law, and that is that can we settle issues without going to the courts in the first place? That would, of course, be preferable. Then it's also in the policies that they must abide with the market rules. Now, of course, we can always get into this big discussion about what are market rules, and there are also very different perspectives on that. But I will claim that a market cannot really work well if we don't have the rule of law. And that is, again, as I said initially, that there is this protection of contracts and property rights of the businesses. The Belt and Road itself, in respect of those the three elements: transparency, access to justice, and equality. Now, transparency. Who is supposed to be transparent when we don't have a single institution? As I said before, China, of course, has a special responsibility here because they are initiating all this, and that's of course where there can be some issues. Is it possible to see through China's human rights performance? transparency in respect of China's corporate law and in respect of subsidies, because that's something, subsidies can be a problem from a market perspective. And if we don't have that transparency, then of course the playing field between European and Chinese companies will not necessarily be seen as equal. Access to justice. Now, which courts are we talking about? If we talk about between states and trade relations, yes, of course, it will go to the World Trade Organization, or in the case of the new regional comprehensive economic partnership, which includes China, they have also a special dispute institution there to handle those issues. The Supreme Court of China is involved in establishing commercial courts that should be applied for the Belt and Road. But we must ask the question, the role of the Supreme Court of China, is there a risk of governmental interference into the court's work? Because if there is that, then we cannot consider it as being impartial. We have also seen examples with Hong Kong courts where there's been interference by politicians into their decisions, which of course, from a rule of law perspective, is highly problematic. And then, of course, we mentioned before the Uyghur people who are apparently in camps at the moment in China, and there are reports suggesting they're used as forced labor. If that's the case, that's first of all, again, an uneven playing field between Chinese businesses and European businesses. And what are their access to justice, those particular people who are in those camps? And then equality between states. I put a question mark here because equality, again, in theory, you would say that states are equal. They are not. We know that the more powerful ones, of course, they have a much bigger impact on the development of international law. The EU has made some Belt and Road reservations, and that is because there's this feeling that there's not equal terms between European businesses and Chinese businesses. I mentioned before something with subsidies, for example, which can be a problem from a market perspective. But there's also in respect of dumped prices, where the EU has its new anti-dumping regime imposing anti-dumping duties on Chinese companies. I've always been doing that. They have a new regime which is not particularly favorable. The old one wasn't favorable to China either. But it's a two-way street, because at the same time we must also ask and keep in mind that those companies that do not dump the prices, they might not be on equal terms with the European businesses. So, and that's of course unfair for the Chinese corporations. So, what's going to happen with the Belt and Road? There are some current issues, of course, COVID-19. What's going to happen after the US trade war? But I see the Belt and Road as it's actually a prospect for promoting the rule of law. But it must come from China in its Belt and Road policies, promote the rule of law, because as I see it, that will also facilitate trade and make it easier for businesses involved in international trade. And I think my time is up now, so I will thank you very much, and I am looking forward to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thanks indeed.